A very good friend of mine. I was just finished Association of American Geographers.
Cool story.
Tight little. Mobility and real deep ethnic in Nicaragua that
Finals week.
so as we all find our home. We get a plum and we say, hey, we got this, but I want to. This research cluster. I want to welcome Chris here to the top.
So photos from Nicaragua that I took, making the tortillas, a shaved coffee farm, and I'll get back. Think about what you think that last picture is up there, because we'll come back to it, and I'll ask if you can. On the PI. And I've been doing a lot of work with the chair of our environmental studies department, and does a lot of spatial analysis and climate related hydrology, climate change, and David Beezer, who was one of our students who recently graduated and is now working for Transform. Some of you guys may have heard that. I want summers primarily, some very a little bit more in that area. Discussion. I'm going to wrap. It's always come from, or they're going to. Produce the food that we eat. What kind about? And so often when and so cases. Forest hazard. Sort of adaptation. But the intent employment formerly homeless that people face. It's the kind of circumstance that I'm talking about. Institution to get a little extra money. Really, there's a it's so small for this would hold if it was down to go on sorts. It is certain to see a certain evolution, migration. Again, we saw because it's a fungus. And eventually, and this has led, this coffee is a perennial crop. Here's a about 20% of Salvador was hit. Affected. So then we look at some people are going to be saying economic. That was enough to sort of the highlands, which bigger, right? It's not shady. Different models. And that into some model was recommended this grad student who went back and surveyed the exact same farmers that I did, 10 years ago. We found that they still had diverse shade, but they actually had fewer shade trees. So the quantity had gone down.
What's the percentage that they have to maintain on their plantation in order to say that all their coffee shade grown? Because it's probably a minimal.
Well, it depends on what certification standard you're looking at. So Smithsonian, is a government program based in Washington. The Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center has a higher standard. You have to be organic, and you have to have a higher percentage of different level. They look at the sort of canopy that's in the. They'll look at the canopy, and you'll have to have. Generally, you'll have to be sort of in this area.
Okay.
Rainforest Alliance generally, from my experience, doesn't have quite as high standard, but they do have standards that, and they have inspectors that go out and look at it. So you might be somewhere in this category.
Interesting.
So I wouldn't necessarily blame the certifications for this shift.
Oh yeah, no, I wasn't implying that. But the idea was that like having shade-grown labels
what's the
should.
additionality of it, right?
Right.
And I think it's an open question, and you need to look at a case by case, and it'd be good to do a broader study.
Right. Interesting.
Do you have a question?
So you're saying that if more people understood the effects of shade grown, there would be like another certification for, this is shade grown coffee, or like this has a higher percentage, or like a.
There could be. I think there could be.
Okay.
If people, people understand this, but I think the certification. Some of the certifications are pretty marginal. Smithsonian has a high standard, but it's unfortunately not as well known. Its business model hasn't really taken off. And maybe it's more like governments that are concerned about ecosystem services like water filtration is being conserved in these coffee farms, which are right above sort of the areas that are very affected by drought, or sometimes themselves affected by it, that will make a difference. So it's an interesting question.
But when the coffee area is expanded, and I know you have a talk you want to give, but has it gone into uncultivated forest?
Again, that would be case by case. Some cases, it's people, with climate change, there are some cases where you see them going further up into a cloud forest area that wasn't previously cultivated. In other cases, they're reforesting, they're planting coffee in an area that used to be pasture. So you can really make a biodiversity benefit kind of argument based on if that's what's happening. So and that's where you really need more in-depth sort of regionally based case studies and land use change. I think they're really fascinating to do that because the different reasons why people make these decisions and what the social and environmental impacts are. That's a good, and I've seen, in most of what I've seen in the sort of Matagalpa region has been some expanding into new pasture, but more sort of thinning out the existing area that they have to put in more coffee bushes. So what I want to get into, though, is thinking about not just the families that are involved in coffee production. So this is a family in Nicaragua. This is the coffee nursery. They're usually about a year in here before they're transplanted. This is probably a mango tree, some bananas, shouldn't be too far away, a number of avocado species. But also how people are making a living. Most people eat corn and beans and rice, and so how are they accessing food? Because if we don't have food security over here, the idea that they're going to continue conserving these landscapes seems precarious. So here are the questions that I was looking at this last survey that I did. Which households, capacities, and livelihood strategies are associated with shorter periods of seasonal hunger? So I really started to focus more on the seasonal hunger question. And less severe post-hazard coping mechanisms, like we're already talking about. And does household affiliation to these different organizations? There's lots of debates, like in agroecology, we're often talking about these farmer organizations are making this huge difference. Okay, but we need to look at the empirical realities. Is this actually what's playing out on the ground based on the perceptions of farmers and our interviews and observations of their farms? And finally, I was really interested in kind of getting at this question about this path-dependent relationship between how people respond to one hazard. So like if the way you responded to Hurricane Mitch in 1998, if that affected how you responded to like a drought in 2009, or is there any kind of correlation, right? Because there's a real interesting idea if you want, we're getting close to this idea of poverty traps, right? But I don't want to go too far into that literature, but I think there are households that are often caught in these circumstances where livelihoods are precarious, a hazard comes in, right? And then instead of coping in a way that's going to make you more resilient for the next hazard, you pull your kids out of school or you sell a key asset, you sell like half your property off, right?
Yeah.
And then what happens when the next hazard comes?
Exactly, exactly.
And so that's the question I wanted to get at in number 3 there. And we were able to set up a sample. We actually, in terms of number 2, we were really interested in these local institutions. So we looked at the market-based approach, which I see more as the organic fair trade certified co-ops that are tied into these international markets, right? They're focusing on coffee exports. I mean, since we've been working with some of them for a while, they're really talking more about diversification, but still, that's their main enterprise activity. And on the other side, we have the more subsistent, and so there's probably in Nicaragua about 15,000 or so farmers that are members of fair trade smallholder cooperatives, right? And think of Nicaragua as about as big as the state of Alabama, I think. Does that sound about, I think that's about right. And then the other approach is the campesino approach, which we've heard a lot about from colleagues at Santa Cruz and elsewhere. And this is the idea, it's more subsistence oriented. Although many of their farmers that are affiliated with them grow coffee, they're focused on the corn and bean production, they're focused on subsistence oriented production, and more diversified farming techniques. So I'm kind of setting these up as a little bit dichotomous. And they have about, they claim they have community-based organizations around Nicaragua and about 30,000 members. So, and I'm interested in how they, like Dustin said in the introduction, how they deal with vulnerability and adaptive capacity, right? And by vulnerability, everybody's doing their literature reviews, whatever, there's lots of definitions. I like kind of the ones coming out of the geography and political ecology, but for this purpose I took the IPCC one, which is a propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected by a hazard, very broad. And then what we're interested really is vulnerability is a function of your sensitivity to a hazard, right? How sensitive are you to that hazard coming in? And that actually has some internal dynamic to it, right? So if you're dependent on rain-fed agriculture and there's a drought, you're going to be particularly sensitive, right? But if you have irrigation, you're not as sensitive. And then the part that I think is critical is the adaptive capacity. This is sort of getting at the resiliency question from my angle. It's like, what's your flexibility? How do you respond when things are difficult, right? Can you change your crop mix easier? Are you able to use community common pool resources like a community forest to access fruit or firewood? Or can you, is there some kind of insurance mechanism that's built into the community, et cetera? Any questions so far? I'm kind of going quickly through this, but we'll get to the results in a minute. And I see adaptive capacity as sort of being built in this iterative process. I use a lot of Haile Eichen from Arizona State University and Lemos. They've talked about this quite a bit. And so we see adaptive capacity can be built, and you can think about generic capacities, right? These are the, specific adaptive capacities. These are the ones that, local knowledge ones that we're really interested in almost, which could be like, your crop diversity, your informal mechanisms, your neighbor who always like bails you out when times are difficult, the way that you plant like 3 or 4 coffee varieties, or maybe 5 or 6. Actually, I was talking to someone who works for the Colombian Coffee Federation, which has been very resistant to the coffee leaf rust outbreak. And she said one strategy that they had is they had 13 different varieties of coffee that they planted, right? So how will they manage agrobiodiversity in this area? But also, and this is where the economist helps me think about these things, and I know this too, as the generic ones like income still matters, education matters, health and mobility, economic productivity, all these things are really important general issues that are going to help you bounce back from these hazards. All right, are we ready to go into the case study now? So here's a map that shows where we're working in northern Nicaragua for this project. So this is not in Matagalpa, right? The brown is where coffee growing regions are, and the study region are these 3 parts of Nueva Segovia near the Honduran border. And these are the communities that we're working in. Actually, we mapped in based on the community names and the local experts. So it's not actually every single farm, but it's down to about like the half-kilometer scale or so of where we conducted these surveys. So this is the current study region. And we did a community-based participatory action research mixed method approach. We've been partnering with a number of cooperatives and nonprofit organizations in the area for this project about the last 7 years. And this really means, collaborating to define research and gather data together, analyzing and sharing results, reflecting critically. I know some of your faculty members here do this approach. I won't go into too much detail. But to me, the hardest part is also how do we use these results for strategic change, right? Even if we generate knowledge together, how can they inform action and change? And this is Maria Eugenia, who's my spouse, and we're doing a workshop returning results to a number of farmers. So that's a poster that we're discussing with them and seeing what they think about it. So here is, again, these institutions in a specific region. I would say the Fair Trade Co-op that we work with, Prote Co-op, is particularly well organized, very strong organization. And the Campesino and the Segovias has been less organized in the last 5 or 10 years. So if you talk to national experts, right, and some of these people have contacts Eric Holton-Menes helped me initially link up with, they'll say they're strong, they have a long history, but they're not as tightly organized, right? So it's important to have that local contextual information. Prote Co-op it's kind of, if you had to cite like the 5 most well-known fair trade co-ops in the world, you would cite Prote Co-op among one of them. It was formed in this sort of classic story in the 1980s, and at the end of the 1980s, when there was a revolution to overthrow a dictatorship, most dictatorship, and there was land reform. And after that land reform, people were trying to make a living, right? Trying to go from those sorts of plowshares, and they're doing a lot longer periods of seasonal hunger when you interview them about those past times. And they realized that they weren't going to be able to keep that land, even though they got it through the agrarian reform, if they weren't able to make some kind of economic returns on it, because they would end up selling it to pay for a medical bill or a childbirth. And so one of the things that some of the professionals that were organizing with them, some of the farmer leaders did, is they got together and they formed these cooperative organizations, right? To access, and this was when fair trade was being launched. So Equal Exchange, a worker-owned coffee roasting co-op in Boston, bought the first container of coffee from these farmers. And eventually they held it together. They survived like last 15 years through the 90s. I guess more than that. Now it's, I mean, if you look at it all the way up to the present, it's been like more like 20 years, 25 years. They've gone through a couple different iterations, but now they've got about 2,300 families organized, 10,000 people, 30 to 40 grassroots co-ops. They move about $10 million or $12 million of coffee a year. They have lots of social development projects. And there's lots of things that they don't always talk about, right? Like covering the funeral expenses for members of their co-op when they pass away, things like that, that they're not going to share in the impact study, right? There's a lot of, they've got their issues like any organization, but they have made it through this far, and they're a great partner to work with.
I'm just trying to clarify one thing. Were
Sure.
they part of the Sandinistas originally, and then?
So most of the members that form the co-op, so there's ex-Contras and ex-Sandinistas that are members of some of these base level cooperatives. It's a good question.
So the revolution was 79, right?
Yeah, the revolution was 79. After the end of the 1980s, the agrarian reform was 1982. There's like 2 or 3 agrarian reform processes, right? 82, 84, and then 86, and then some at the end of like 89, right? Many of the titles went from going to a collective cooperative organization that was really run top down through Manindra to community-based organizations that didn't really know how to manage that land by the 1990s when the Sandinistas lost the election. And then there would be 2 or 3 titles for some of those pieces of land, and there was both an economic struggle to keep a hold of that land and sometimes an armed struggle.
So these came out of the reapportionment after the election?
No, before.
Okay.
They were titled before. And during probably most of the title, it depends on the specific local organization, but most of them were like 80, I think around 86. And there's contested titles, right? That's a long history of that.
Okay, sorry, I just.
No, it's a good question. I know you know the history too. So, and most of the leadership within Prote Co-op historically has been more leaning towards Sandinistas, but it hasn't been like a sort of hardline kind of organization. I think it's also important, some of the recent research, and this is for all folks here, is that this is, for example, Rika Santos. So she came to Nicaragua and we're GPSing the boundary around some of these co-ops, and then helped a lot with the data analysis and statistics, and ended up being a co-author on this article on global environmental change. And then she used this article when she went in to interview at Pew Trusts in Washington, D.C., so a lot of Pew is a pretty leading think tank. And so she came in there for this interview and said, yeah, here's one of the publications I've done. And so I think there's always a role for interaction between students, community members from here, and community members in Nicaragua. Some of the methods I used for this particular study: participant observation, focus groups. Then I trained local promotores and farmers that were involved in field testing and then conducting a household survey. And we also looked at some hydro-climatic data and samples, field samples from, particularly from streams and wells, and geospatial data downloads. We had a pretty systematic approach to our selection criteria for our sample. We stratified municipality and by farmer organization. Everybody had to grow at least some coffee. They had to be under 6 hectares and a similar altitude and proximity. So that gave us, and we can talk more about this, a sample that looked like this. So here we've got the proto-co-op population, the proto-co-op sample, the campesino population, the campesino sample, and the nearest neighbor at a similar altitude with a similar sized farm to these 2 areas per municipality. So we ended up with a total of, I think we had about 368 valid surveys after we went through this. Lots of time for all you guys who are sitting through data sheets, going through those spreadsheets. Lots of time checking, cross-checking the data, all that fun stuff. Here are some of the results. There's some basic hardship indicators looking at all the surveys together. So they report a percentage of coffee plot affected by the roya. So we see, 149 households reported that 75 to 100% of their coffee was affected by the roya. So this was, in this region, was a massive impact. And then we see the other data here, and then we can go over here in terms of the change in their coffee harvest. So from 2011 to 2014, between these 2 harvests, 50% drop up to 100% drop.
That's nuts.
So it was a pretty dramatic. The last 2 days I've been talking to a journalist at Fortune magazine. I have no idea how they got my name, but she was doing an article on coffee enterprises. And they hadn't really talked about the roya and food security. I'm like, you've got to talk about this in the article. And we'll see what comes out, because these are dramatic, right? And then lean months, we asked, which months are hard for you to meet your basic food needs. We see between 3 and 4, the average of about 3 lean months per year, right? That are being reported. Kind of a nice bell curve kind of shape there. And number of months without sufficient water access. We see very variable in this case. To me, what this highlights is, so a lot of people, 30 households said they have sufficient water all the time, but we had 20 households that said only 6 months out of the year. So there's seasonality in water access, and this is really the future of where I want to go with some of the work. Also this is the ethnographic part that I talked to Dustin about, that Dustin mentioned. This is a seasonal calendar, because we've got to, when we're trying to do these action research projects, even if you're just working locally, right? It's like, how does the communities, they don't work on the semester system or the quarter system, right? And then even in co-ops, the way that the farmers are organizing their livelihood could be different than the central co-op. And so these are just to think about what's happening these are the lean months, right? So what's happening during that time? So for coffee, there might be inspections. It's like fair trade organic inspections. So inspectors are coming to town and people are filling all that paperwork out, like being accredited at the university or something. We've got weeding, harvesting, corn plowing. So they might be getting the corn ready. And in fact, a lot of times they'll plant the corn in May or June. So they might be doing some weeding and fertilizing if they have organic or conventional fertilizer. Might be planting some beans. And then also right through here, we've got a period of there's a little mid-semester break.
Yeah.
And that's interesting, because where do a lot of kids get access to food?
Yeah.
School, right? So, and this is something we pointed out to them. So the most frequent lean month is July, which is the same month a lot of people, if they can take a vacation, it's also the month that the kids are out of school and they're not getting access to the school food programs, which can be through the government, etc. So this really helped, think about what kinds of strategies can address this challenge, right? That's where we see the hungry season. All right, I won't go through all the numbers here, but I'll show a little bit. So here's a comparison of wealth and income. We got the N is the number of valid responses here, the mean, standard deviation. The control group are those neighbors. MCAC is the campesino, FTC is fair trade. These show us when there's a statistical significance of just doing comparison of means between these different groups. So we saw, for example, the fair trade farmers are statistically have larger farm than the campesino farmers. We saw in terms of income sources that actually they were a little bit higher for campesino than they were for fair trade, which is interesting, but not surprising given the coffee leaf rust outbreak and the loss of income from coffee revenues if they were more dependent on coffee revenues. We went through one indicator which is important. Do they sell beans? Do they sell corn? Farm production diversity. I'll sum it up basically like this. Demographics profiles were broadly similar. In general, the campesino farmers, affiliated farmers, tend to have more diversified sources of income. And statistically, they were more likely to work off their farm. And generally, their crop mix was a little bit more diverse. What about those coping mechanisms we were talking about? So we actually went through and we asked a set of questions about their coping mechanisms to Hurricane Mitch, to the 2009 drought, and to the coffee leaf rust roya, right? That's a coffee leaf rust outbreak. And there's a lot of data here. I want to point out a couple things. So very common for people to reduce their household expenditures. That's almost expected, right? Spend their savings. This is a big one. When we asked them which of these are more severe for you, selling your future crop harvest is a big deal because that means you're accepting low payment for that crop. At really bad terms, it could be high interest rates. I mean, they're like this sort of 10% a month kind of interest rates. It's sort of built into this exchange. It gets into it. A lot of people are asking for more credit. Some people saying just suffer through it. We had an interesting debate with this one because I talked to the economists. Well, just suffering through it, doing nothing, that's okay. But when I did these focus groups with the farmers this last summer, and everybody said, no, suffering through it is not okay. That's like the worst response, to do nothing. You've got to do something because, and then why might they say that as being one of their worst responses? It seems like it wouldn't be as bad maybe from our perspective. What's behind that attitude? Anybody have an idea?
I know that like a lot of Latin Americans, they like work hard. Like, they see they want to see an improvement in their work, and they want to see an actual like yield. And
and part of it is that sense of hopelessness, right? If you just suffer through it, you've kind of lost hope. And that to them, that was one of the most important points. It's like you do something to respond. Even if it's not the right thing, respond, right?
Well, adaptive strategies are absolutely more important. I mean, like, no matter how we deal with day-to-day things, some of us live paycheck to paycheck, and we seem to be okay with it. And,
right.
You know, in some respect, the idea that we're sort of grown accustomed to that, like, well, it's just another day, another dollar, day by day.
But this is when that day by day gets cut,
exactly,
right?
Get cut, yeah.
Is government doing something for that?
Well, we're going to get to the response in a minute, but the government response in this case is, for the case of the coffee rust and to some extent the drought in Nicaragua, has been pretty weak.
What's the difference in your rubric between doing nothing and reducing household expenditures? I mean, if you don't
Well,
have the money,
yeah.
you're not spending it.
There were two different survey questions. So we asked them, how have you responded to the how have you responded to the coffee leaf rust outbreak since in the last 3 years? Have you reduced your household expenditures? Yes or no?
Mm-hmm.
Have you sought off-farm employment? Yes or no?
Which is, as a respondent, if I were to put those forward, right, I've lost a bunch of money
Yeah.
or a bunch of coffee,
Yeah.
and doing nothing isn't an option because it's been happening to me. It's kind of a meaningless almost to say, do nothing.
Yeah.
Well, you have to do something because it happened. It's there. And so it's a hard question to answer, whereas reducing household expenditures
Yeah.
feels the same as doing nothing.
Yeah.
So I'm
Well,
curious about that dichotomy as well.
well, it's interesting then, that's an interesting interpretation. When we talked about it in focus groups, they all were really clear that some people just kind of gave up. And for them, doing nothing was the equivalent of giving up when they responded. So the same people that answered these survey questions, we went back and did focus groups, not with all of them, but we did 12 focus groups. And they said doing nothing for us is the weakest possible response.
I hear it rhetorically. I'm not sure what it means in terms of behavior, but it's
Right.
interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think what's important is it's their interpretation, right? And how they would weight it.
Yeah.
The variables that correlated strongly here are, so we saw the age of the head of household. This is number of lean months as a dependent variable, and the age of the head of household. So we had a significant correlation connecting. So there was more lean months. If the person who, if the head of household was older, there were more lean months reported. If the farm size was larger, there were less lean months reported. If the coffee production harvest loss was smaller, there was fewer lean months reported. If the corn shortfall, if they harvested, this is based on ask what they need versus what they actually harvested, was larger, there were more lean months reported. If they sold beans, there were fewer lean months reported. If the number of fruit trees that they reported having on their farms was larger, there were fewer lean months reported. And if they produced more than half the food that they eat on their farm, there were fewer lean months reported. So these are some statistical outcomes of the survey. And some of these we can explain by contextual variables. For example, we saw a spike in the average bean price in this area, right? We saw, this is the average from 2010 to 2014, the average bean prices here. This is dollars per hundredweight. And this, the black here, is the 2014 price spike. And this is kind of what you might expect because there was a drought that was happening simultaneously. So you have a drought happening simultaneous to a where farmers are losing their harvest. So if you're able to sell beans, they're up to like $95 for 100 pounds, right? And so it's hard to access them, but if you could sell them, you could get that revenue and you could use it to buy other food.
I'm curious, so in relation to the rust issue and the drought issue, any natural disasters that might occur, did in regard to your research, you take into account how they communicate with each other in order to dictate their behavior in the market? Like, and the reason why I'm saying, a friend of mine, Peter Keller, he was co-founder of Coffee Kids, and he did a lot of work in Rwanda.
Yeah.
So one thing they found, there's a lot of farmers who wanted to participate in the market, but they couldn't communicate with each other, so they didn't know the market price. So they were actually always getting like under. So he instigated this solar-powered radio program where the farmers can communicate with each other, know the market price, and price their coffee, their harvest accordingly to compete with the market. So I'm wondering what their communication systems are built on, what's infrastructure, how do the Cappuccino communicate in relation to the FTC, and how does that dictate their behavior in the market?
Very interesting question. I mean, I think the short answer is the Fair Trade Co-op has a very good communication process in terms of coffee prices and coffee volumes and quality standards. Okay. The Campesino is more oriented as a social process and solidarity oriented in sharing sustainable agriculture and agroecology practices, and there's not as much commercial information that's exchanged. One exception is community-based seed banks, where there is some flow of genetic material and ideas and seeds between these organizations, both between the Fair Trade and the Campesino and within Campesino.
Interesting.
But not a lot of collective commercialization efforts in terms of bean and corn, although that's changing a little bit in the co-op.
Okay.
Good question. I'll go about another 10 minutes to wrap up here. One thing that we found, though, I think what was interesting for me was the finding about number of fruit trees, right? And this is a good sort of agroforestry finding that we saw multiple times. We basically saw, one of the takeaways I take from this is the importance of diversified, subsistence-oriented production, and also off-farm employment. Let's not forget that, right? And the importance of shade of fruit trees in terms of shorter periods of seasonal hunger. We came back around and we looked at, here we're looking at these coping mechanisms, and we're actually, here we have the coping mechanism severity, so we scored those coping mechanisms. And it is a subjective weight at how you score those different weights, right? For which coping mechanism is more severe than the other ones, and that's why we went back and used the World Food Program methodology to do these focus groups I was mentioning. We scored the coping mechanisms to the drought, to the roya, and we also looked at the number of lean months. And so here's another set of regressions. A couple things that we see in here, we saw, for example, those that had that sold beans reported less severe coping mechanisms in response to the drought. We had some sort of counterintuitive things, like actually one that we thought was really consistent was the number of fruit trees, log number of fruit trees. Again, we saw less severe coping mechanisms to the roya and fewer lean months. We also saw past hazards. This is that past hazards question I proposed. People that reported more severe coping mechanisms in response to Hurricane Mitch also reported more severe coping mechanisms in response to the drought of 2009 and to the 2010 through 2014 coffee leaf rust outbreak. So we really saw some pretty strong evidence of this path dependency and how people are responding, or at least reporting their response to these past hazards. And I think that question
that comes up here, right? How they responded to Mitch versus the drought versus the Roya is worth thinking about what kind of interventions can work moving forward. Is it just that they always, every time they're hit with a hazard, they always, take a more severe measure, they pull a kid out of school, they skip meals, or is it that they're looking for coping mechanisms like diversifying their farm that could be more effective? Just a couple quotes. This is also looking at the role of institutions. What can be said, especially now that they talked about they got some seeds, and INTA is the agricultural ministry, which has done a lot of great work here, but there's also been some concerns about the seeds they received that didn't work for the 2009, this is for the 2009-2010 drought. And then they also talk about how do they plan to address this? Store enough food, economize, diversify the farm, home gardens, right? Coffee parcels, how can they address these challenges? So what do we see in terms of these local organizations? Well, I was kind of thinking maybe fair trade is going to be better, maybe campesino. Neither of them had a dramatic impact, which is kind of interesting, right? We did see, but I do think they can shape the practices and the future livelihoods to some extent of their affiliated farmers if the farmers want to go that way. Let me wrap up with a couple things about what can be done, right? First of all, what's being done? Some people are asking about the government response. The government in Nicaragua is not doing a lot about the drought or the Roya. It's kind of been underserved. In Central America, it's highly varied. Guatemala allocated $100 million for large and medium producers, not smallholders. Costa Rica, $40 million for smallholders. International development, no big push in the coffee industry, but there's been some initiatives with some of the larger coffee roasters and smaller ones. There's been some loans and grants. USAID is coming along. So it's an uneven response. Some of this is being folded into current debates in Congress about the Central American crisis. There's $1 billion that Biden's been talking about in terms of responding to the current, partially provoked by the child migration issues, right, in Central America. How about farmers? Well, they're doing we did a lot of work sort of linking together best practices with the Community Agroecology Network, the Protocol Cooperative, some funding from Green Mountain Coffee Roasters. So they are doing a lot of practices that can work. We spent a lot of time talking about them. I won't take you guys through this, but here's an example of a poster we talked to promoters and agronomists about that sort of summarize the results of past research. We spent like an hour and a half going through this with them and analyzing these results, right, in Spanish. Collective action response, I think linking agroecology with food security and seed sovereignty. So about 500, these results were passed along to a development project, and about 700 households planted home gardens. They also set up co-op-led grain banks, community-based corn and bean seed banks, but also grain banks where they would buy the corn when the prices were lower and redistribute it during those lean months to their members instead of waiting for like UN World Food Program or somebody else to do it. They would basically set up their own, use the cooperative structure to relocalize their access to corn and beans during those critical June, July, and August months. And it's been working, the volumes have been pretty significant that they've moved. Again, with the challenge of the drought and the Roya, it hasn't eliminated poverty by any stretch. A lot of times we bring students up. Here's a student talking to one of our students. This is a youth from Nicaragua, Javier, who's up and meeting with Morgan, who later went to Nicaragua on an exchange to Santa Clara. We'd be happy to link them up here if it makes sense someday to bring, a lot of times with a nonprofit organization, we bring youth leaders and farmer leaders up to Santa Clara or San Jose. Next steps, we just received 3 years of funding from the National Science Foundation, Geography, to do a project that's going to continue looking at these issues. So they saw the background research here. So basically that survey I showed you was this 2014 baseline survey. And we want to look at vulnerability and resilience in these same households again in 2017. And we really want to look at what practices and strategies are going to make them more resilient to the next hazard. Right? So we're going to use the funding from this NSF project and our on-the-ground collaborations to take this to the next level. Very interested in how climatic change is going to influence water availability in the many ways that people use water, right? From bathing and washing clothes to drinking. And we're going to already have our next hazard, right? El Nino here, rain here, is drought in Central America. And you already have the World Food Program talking about the risk of the current drought, right? This is like a couple of weeks ago. Talking about the risk of drought in the Central American dry corridor, which includes some of the lowlands that are connected to the study area here. So in summary, the convergence of the coffee leaf rust outbreak and the drought have contributed to rural food security like we thought. Less household food security was associated with certain types of diversified subsistence-oriented production and off-farm employment in larger farms. Households with longer periods of seasonal hunger reported more severe coping strategies from previous and current hazards. So they've got this coping strategy argument. And institutions could, but have not yet, played a major influential role in shaping this response. So there's a lot more that I would say needs to be done. There's a lot of ways to try to link that food and water security that I was trying to get at there. So thanks, guys, and all these folks.
Okay, let's field some questions. What a wonderful talk. Thank you, Chris, for that.
Thanks for coming. Yes?
Are we going to ask the government for more help out there?
Yes, there's been some protest. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic. I mean, the government on one level, yeah, there have been requests to the government for more assistance. There are some programs. They have like an Hambre Cero program, which is modeled off the Brazilian Lume Cero, like zero hunger program. And it's just been a little bit slow in coming to some of the coffee growing regions. There has been some limited food assistance to coffee smallholders from the government. But it's been, if you talk to most of the farmers, they will not list them as a source of help in these current circumstances. But they want to. The government, I mean, no, I think there's interest. And it's not, at one point during the sort of depths of this, they actually sacked the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of New Cooperative and Social Economy. Nobody knows for sure why, but it might have been partially related to the slow response. Yeah.
Actually, I have 2 questions related to I don't know your name's question, but when I was there in the 80s, I observed that when the government did provide, for example, beans and rice, it actually undermined the farmers, and that the creation of the dependency on the government ended up benefiting the folks who couldn't work stuff. So the folks who could get it, move it, sell it, buy it, trade it. And the actual farmers, the actual subsistence farmers, that's when the price dropped.
Right.
So if there was any kind of outside support, it would go to the more resource-rich farmers, and the more resource-poor farmers wouldn't do as well. Have you looked at that at all? I saw you had differences between different countries in terms of how much the government has intervened.
No, I think that's a really good point. And it actually goes to your question too, because there are these local grain traders that can kind of influence the market, or they can be policy, they can be sort of maneuver people, people that maneuver in the government. The government has responded to the high bean prices, and they did this, and in some of the rural areas and maybe trying to avoid some of these mistakes from the previous time, through a national grain reserve program, where they were offering credit to corn and bean growers, and they were trying to redistribute corn and beans during those periods when the price would peak, in order to level off those peaks in the national markets. Obviously, it didn't work in 2014, but it's worked a little bit better since the harvest has been larger too since then.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is that what I saw from your results is that those high bean prices actually provided resilience to the farms. So if the government is functioning to reduce the prices, there's a counter argument that maybe one doesn't want to, in fact, reduce the
and part of what they've been doing is providing low-cost beans in the urban areas where people don't grow the beans, potentially because of that.
Right. Well, it's an interesting.
It is. No, it is.
Anyway.
As long as you harvested those beans, if you lost those beans in the drought, then you were in trouble. But if you harvested some, you're doing doubly. You're better off.
Right. Right. The other thing that I was curious about, again, when I was there, the coffee growers were the wealthiest farmers.
Yes.
It was really the other folks who were suffering in times of need.
Yes.
Are you looking at other sectors besides the coffee growers?
That's a really good, that's the question. Even a smallholder coffee grower is usually better off than somebody who's just growing corn and beans. And it's still generally the perception in Nicaragua. But with the leaf rust outbreak, if you only have like 2 or 3 acres or manzanas of coffee, right, it's going to be, which is, because they're a little higher up in altitude, sometimes they have a little bit more precipitation. They might be a little bit less vulnerable, but I'm not comparing it directly to people that are only growing corn and beans. But I will say Claudia Rodell, maybe you know her work. She's working in some parts of Nicaragua, and like El Sauce, that doesn't grow coffee, and she's finding higher migration rates. And that was one thing I wanted to point on those coping mechanisms. There was very low migration. Did you guys notice that at the bottom? It was way back here, right? Very low sort of out migration that they linked attributed to these hazards. Because you hear a lot of people talking about it. She's finding much more seasonal migration. She was actually finding people migrating from like these people that aren't growing coffee, migrating to like El Salvador to do day labor in El Salvador, or to work as laborers, and then they take the money they earn and buy pesticides and fertilizer for their farm back in El Salvador. So very complex sort of chain migration link in there.
One last tiny thing.
Sure.
Everyone I know in San Jose is buying land in
I
Nicaragua,
know.
specifically right now. Are you seeing that in the coffee region?
It's almost all, I'm glad you brought it up, because my mom brought the same thing recently, and I've seen it's most of the southern part of the country. It's the Managua, south, and then all along the coastal areas. Massive real estate investment to the period, really speculative in some cases.
And the canal is going to be part of that?
Well, the canal, that's the question I was waiting for somebody to ask.
Yeah, you stole my question.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was gonna redirect everything.
What's the canal question?
What's going on with the canal?
Well, I mean-
The national headline about Nicaragua